Yeah, man. Like I said, I was just really happy to be there. Like I loved SF, and
Mm-hmm.
like basically our schedule was we'd go to war, and then I wasn't married at the time. I didn't have a family. Most of the guys on the team did. And so basically I could go to whatever school I wanted to go to. Like when we get back from deployments, because there wasn't a lot of competition for it because guys were smoked. They were kind of getting burned out. And so there's only a handful of us that were like, hey, we want to go train. We want to go to this school, that school. And so it was like, then you could come home, go party, and then you could go to some schools, and then you'd go to combat again. And I was like, man, fifth group's like the greatest place in the world. Like this is awesome. I want more, you know?
What schools did you pick?
So I picked right after my first deployment, I went to dive school because it was a dive team. I'd already been to pre-scuba when I was in Ranger Battalion. Wanted to go there so I could solidify my place on the team because that's like the second check. Like you get your green beret, you get assigned to a team, and if you're on a dive team, you got to pass dive school. Otherwise, they'll send you to a regular team. And so I was really wanted to get dive school done so I could solidify my position on my ODA. So I went to dive school between my first and second deployment, and then between my second and my third because I had been exposed so much to the human intelligence side of things, and like that was really kind of where my head was going. I kind of had an epiphany on my, I think, second trip. I was like, man, the issue with this war isn't can we kill the bad guys? Like whenever we put the bad guys in time and space, like we win. You know, whether it's us with our Iraqi commandos, whether it's, you know, whatever, the Rangers, the SEALs, whoever, the Marines, the Kentucky National Guard, like America wins. The problem is finding these guys. And also there was a massive amount of confusion too, because I just felt like we did not understand Iraq at all. Like all this nonsense we got told about, number one, weapons of mass destruction, but then all the crap we got told about like, oh, be greeted as liberators and, you know, we're going to install this new puppet government. Like all that just kept exploding in our faces. And so I was like, man, the challenge in this war is number one, locating the enemy, like doing the intel work, running sources, doing surveillance, like that type of stuff right there is, you know, premium skill set type of skills that you needed to be successful in that. And my second trip, we had a special forces warrant officer on my team who really made it his, you know, his role on that deployment was to map out Jaish al-Mahdi and to figure out where they were. And he was running a handful of sources, and he'd bring me along every now and again on source meetings. And I was just really impressed that, like, you know, here we were, just a couple guys, you know, with initiative, a little bit of money, and we were able to map out like where the vast majority of these bad guys were, whether it was Sauter's guys or a lot of the folks that Al-Qaeda was kidnapping at the time. We were able to start running down a lot of those kidnapping cells, and that's because we were juiced into the population. So after my second trip, I wanted to go to one of our human intelligence courses so I could be qualified to do that. And that kind of set the trajectory really for the rest of my career in the military.
Interesting. Did you ever get into the ASOT stuff?
Yeah, exactly. That's what I went to.
That's what that is?
Yeah, that's what I went to. And then much later on, I went to the farm.
So, I mean, that's a long pipeline.
It's a long course, yeah.
Can you talk about that?
I can try. Yeah. I mean, it's a school that teaches, you know, you how to basically run human sources. There's a lot of like lines there where what the CIA is authorized to do versus what, you know, soldiers are allowed to do. But yeah, without getting into too many details, I mean, you have to learn basic, you know, agent handling skills. You have to learn how to debrief people, how to, you know, spot whether or not they're lying to you to the best of your ability. But then
how
also,
would you do that? What are some of those tactics?
What's that?
What are some of those things you learned about?
Yeah, I mean, some people get really into the neuro-linguistic programming, like how people sit and like, do they look up and left, right and left? Do they rub that? Like, with a whole different culture, I think that probably applies a lot to police officers in America, where you're dealing with your own culture. Trying to apply a lot of that to a foreign culture, I think, is very challenging unless you're deeply steeped in that culture. So for me, it was always like, check the checkables. If somebody's coming to you and they're like saying, hey, I am part of Jaish al-Mahdi, I'm part of Al-Qaeda. I'm like, okay, can you prove to me, like, how are you a member of that organization? Just very basic, like, is this person who they say they are? Because if they can't positively identify themselves to you, or they can't really prove what they have access to, whatever information they're going to tell you, it's either completely made up or it has an agenda of its own. So I think that's one of I think journalists have to do this as well. It's like, what are your you have all these things you want to tell me, but you need to explain to me how you actually have access to it. So I think that's probably the most fundamental. There's a bunch of other stuff that we can do to check in on people. But I think that's probably at the very basic level. What we look for when we're meeting a new potential asset.
I mean, I find that to be an interesting route for you because you're so into.
Yeah.
It sounds like you're so into the kinetic.
Yeah.
In your face action of being a SF guy, and then you take this which is almost it's under the radar, kind of behind the scenes.
Yeah.
And you're dealing with people.
Yeah, 100%. Oh, I was surprised too. But when I was over there, number one, just being impatient, I was, especially when we were doing unilateral direct action, we'd get intelligence from like our intelligence cell. And I was always like, where does this mysterious intelligence come from? Like we get it in the form of like, we think this bad guy's in this house and this bad guy's important because of X, Y, and Z. And I always had it in my head. I'm like, how do we know that? Like, is this something that's really, really interesting and like sophisticated, But then, you hit enough dry holes, you're like, I don't think this is something that's very sophisticated. I think sometimes they're doing the best they can. But then it was really once we started working with the Iraqis, I was like, okay, the actual cheat code is understanding the culture and understanding the people. And the closer that you are to the people, the more that you're going to be able to understand. And the faster you're going to be able to get to target, the faster you're going to be able to produce your own targets. And that's one of the unique things about Special Forces, about a Special Forces ODA, is that organically we can do our own human intelligence, and then we can analyze our own intelligence, and then we can train up a force, or we can prosecute the target ourselves. So we can basically do cradle to grave targeting. And that was what I noticed was different from us. Once we branched out and we started doing, especially the commando mission, I was like, okay, I can see our unique role here, because you had everybody else. You had the Rangers, the SEALs, you had the Marine Corps Det 1 guys, the MARSOC guy, the initial MARSOC guys. Everybody was kind of competing for the same DA kinetic mission. They were competing for assets. They were competing for the targets, And so it was like, now I see what our niche is here. We can do that, sure. But our niche is being down here with the local population, mapping out the human terrain, but then also at the same time being able to take our indigenous forces out there and prosecute the target at the same time. So I really liked that autonomy, and it put me much more in the driver's seat, being a part of the intel side, because it was like, oh, now I'm driving operations because I'm the guy collecting the intelligence.
It's totally. I mean, it's you're self-sufficient.
Yeah.
At that point.
Yeah.
Was there any regret into kind of taking that route versus staying in a more?
Not really, man. I really liked it because especially as the wars went on, it just seemed like we were screwing up the U.S. government, like we were screwing up the intel piece. Like we were pretty good at hunting. Like once we got the bad guys in our crosshairs, like they were going to get dead or they were going to get a set of flex cuffs. Like that was just it. But could we find them? That was a big thing. Also on my 2004 trip, that's when Zarqawi was doing a lot of the kidnapping and putting the beheading videos up. We had really good intel from one of our sources who basically was like, I know who the guy standing by Zarqawi is, and we know where he is, but he's in this area where like you guys really can't get into. Because we had we had been training up a low visibility like snatch team with our Iraqis, we were able to go get in garb and blend in and snatch this guy who was part of this kidnapping cell out of his apartment. Probably the coolest mission I've ever been on in my life. But basically, the big army wouldn't go into the area because it was in Abu Ghraib, just on the other side of where the prison is. They wouldn't go in there because they were just like, every time we go in there, we get stitched up by IEDs. Like, we're not going to do it. We had moved so fast that basically we were just to the outskirts of the city by the time we even like called it back in, because this is before people had constant connectivity in the team houses. So by the time we called in that we were going out there back to our headquarters, they were like, well, this pertains to hostage rescues, so we think that like one of the JSOC units should do it. And basically like my team leadership was like, yeah, we're less than a mile away. We're just going to go ahead and do this. Like, we'll let you know when it's done. And I was like, wow, because we're juiced into the human terrain, because we're running our own intel, we're actually beating the guys who in theory are supposed to be handling this, the guys who are supposed to be one rung up from us, we're actually beating them to target, and that didn't happen every time. Obviously they were doing great things, but that was a big eye opener for me, especially coming out of Ranger Battalion. I was like, because we're down here, because we're dealing with the populace, we're running our own intel, we're beating people to target, and we're coming up with unconventional solutions. We're not getting on a helicopter every time and waiting for us to have a cordon force. We're sneaking into these places in whatever vehicles we can acquire off target. We were doing a lot of stuff. We were jumping out of bread trucks as well, broad daylight, just places where the big army wouldn't go. And even a lot of the other units couldn't get into, but that's because we were living downtown amongst the populace.
Let's talk about that operation.
Yeah.
From start to finish.
Yeah. Yeah, so we were at our team house, and one of our sister teams calls us up and says, "Hey, this team, our sister dive team, was living in a different part of Baghdad. They didn't have an assault force. They didn't have Iraqis they were training up. They were doing basically unilateral intelligence operations." And they said, "Hey, we've got a guy that knows where these American contractors and British contractors are being held because he was in the video." And he's identified one of the guys that was in the video. And he knows where he is. And so basically this source knew where one of the members of the beheading cell was, and he was in Abu Ghraib. So they briefed up the source, and they said, what we need for you guys is we just need a handful of people that can blend. They knew that we had been out doing a lot of reconnaissance in the area, because we recon all of our targets before we hit them in indigenous clothing. We had grabbed a couple guys here and there off the street. Like if you were doing a recon and you can make positive ID, why wait for that night? Why not just grab them now? So we had done a little bit of that, but so our sister team knew that we had that capability. So we loaded up a handful of our Iraqis and then 4 of us Americans that had been out and about in the city a lot. We went out there, we got the brief from them, from that team, and then we went to the local American FOB where the big army, the closest big army unit was, just to tell them, hey, we're going to go into this area, and what's your radio frequency? Can we call you if we get into heavy contact, any of that type of stuff? And that's when that regular army unit was like, you guys can go in there if you want, but we don't go in there. You know that, right? And we were like, yeah, we're aware. We're like, what are the threats? They're like, yeah, we just get stitched up every time we go in there. RPGs, IEDs. Like, these guys aren't playing around. I'm like, all right, well, we're taking an Opal in a Scooby van, so so I think we're gonna blend in. And it was night, but it wasn't super late. It was like 8 or 9 o'clock at night, because we needed traffic to blend in with. So if we would have waited till the typical 2 or 3 in the morning, like we usually do, there wouldn't have been anybody on the road. So we leave in our one Opal in the lead, and then a van trailing much further behind. I'm in the lead vehicle with one other American and other Iraqis. And so we get there to the front. It's an apartment complex that we're going into, and we're looking for apartment number 7, I think it was. And so we get into where the apartment is, and there's a bunch of guys just out there malingering, hanging out, like just young military age guys. It's wintertime too, so it looks like they're potentially armed. But we want to get in and get out as quietly as we possibly can, because our overall goal is to snatch this member of the beheading cell so that we can snatch him. We can get information on where the hostages are being held. Mm-hmm. So we don't, if we end up having to go loud and we end up like killing the guy or whatever, then the hostages get moved and we got nothing. So our whole goal is to get in there as quietly as possible. So before we left, we basically said like no English on target. And so we're all dressed up. I had a dish dash on with my M4 underneath it. Had one of those like breakaway dish dashes, light skin body armor underneath it, and then a keffiyeh covering my face. And that's basically how all the Americans are dressed. Iraqis are dressed similar. Luckily, our Iraqis went up first, made contact to talk to the guys that were out front. They said something to the effect of, we're with one of the other groups. I think Ansar al-Sunna, like we're with this group. Don't say shit. Just stand here. Like if you know it's good for you, just stand here. And so we kind of file past. We go. We know the guy's name. One of our Iraqis knocks on the door. The dude's mom like cracks the door, and I'm pulling security in the hallway, just trying to make sure that nobody comes up the hall. And she cracks the door, and our Iraqi says, "Hey, I think the guy's name was Ziad or Jabbar or something like that. Is Ziad here?" And she's like, "No, he's sleeping." And he said, "Okay, well, I really need to talk to him." He kind of got her to crack the door open a little bit more, just enough for him to get his foot in. right when he got his foot in, like we silently flow in there. One of the Iraqis puts the hands over the mom's mouth. We come in and like literally her son, this kid, is just asleep on a sleeping mat, like on a bed, AK by him and a phone by him.
He's a kid?
He's, I don't know, teenager maybe. Maybe he was in his 20s, but young enough that he's still not married and living with his parents.
It always interests me how young some of these leaders are.
Yeah.
You know, on the opposing side.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I was 24 at the time, and so he's probably he looked like he was younger than me, but they're asleep. So we got him. We keep his mom gagged, grab him, and now we have to get out. And so our Iraqis kind of walked ahead. They made sure the hallway was clear, and so his mom's freaked out.
Was he combative at all?
No, because we basically got him. Like he got woken up with a bunch of guys with keffiyehs covering their faces in his face, saying, "Just give us your hands." And he looked around, and he was, he had a hand over his mouth. Flex cuffed him, put another keffiyeh or a shirt over his cuff so people couldn't see that he was cuffed. That's what we didn't cuff him in the back. We cuffed him in the front so he could kind of walk out like this. And so we walk him and his mom out, have the van come around, throw them in the van, hop in the car, and we get off target that way.